This is a reading from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion. Akalabeth, the Downfall of Numenor. It is said by the Eldar that men came into the world in the time of the shadow of Morgoth, and they fell swiftly under his dominion, for he sent his emissaries among them, and they listened to his evil and cunning words, and they worshipped the darkness, and yet feared it. But there were some that turned from evil and left the lands of their kindred, and wandered ever westward, for they had heard a rumor that in the west there was a light which the shadow could not dim. The servants of Morgoth pursued them with hatred, and their ways were long and hard. Yet they came at last to the lands that looked upon the sea, and they entered Beleriand in the days of the War of the Jewels. The Edain these were named in the Sindarin tongue, and they became friends and allies of the Eldar, and did deeds of great valor in the war against Morgoth. Of them was sprung, upon the side of his fathers, bright Eärendil. And in the Lay of Eärendil it is told how at the last, when the victory of Morgoth was almost complete, he built his ship Vingilat, that men called Rothinzil, and voyaged upon the unsailed seas, seeking ever for Valinor, for he desired to speak before the powers, on behalf of the two kindreds, that the Valar might have pity on them, and send them help in their uttermost need. Therefore by elves and men he is called Eärendil, the Blessed, for he achieved his quest, after long labours and many perils, and from Valinor there came the host of the lords of the west. But Eärendil came never back to the lands that he had loved. In the great battle, when at last Morgoth was overthrown, and Thangorajim was broken, the Edain alone of the kindreds of men fought for the Valar, whereas many others fought for Morgoth. And after the victory of the lords of the west, those of the evil men who were not destroyed fled back into the east, where many of their race were still wandering in the unharvested lands, wild and lawless, refusing alike the summons of the Valar and of Morgoth. And the evil men came among them, and cast over them a shadow of fear, and they took them for kings. Then the Valar forsook for a time the men of Middle-earth, who had refused their summons, and had taken the friends of Morgoth to be their masters. And men dwelt in darkness, and were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion, demons and dragons and misshapen beasts, and the unclean orcs that are mockeries of the children of Iluvatar, and the lot of men was unhappy. But Manwë put forth Morgoth, and shut him beyond the world in the void that is without, and he cannot himself return again into the world, present and visible, while the lords of the west are still enthroned. Yet the seeds that he had planted still grew and sprouted, bearing evil fruit if any would tend them. For his will remained, and guided his servants, moving them ever to thwart the will of the Valar, and to destroy those that obeyed them. This the lords of the west knew full well. When therefore Morgoth had been thrust forth, they held counsel concerning the ages that should come after. The Eldar they summoned to return into the west, and those that hearkened to the summons dwelt in the Isle of Erisea, and there is in that land a haven that is named Avalon, for it is of all cities the nearest to Valinor, and the tower of Avalone is the first sight that the mariner beholds when at the last he draws nigh to the undying lands, over the leagues of the sea. To the fathers of men, of the three faithful houses, rich reward also was given. Eonwë came among them and taught them, and they were given wisdom and power and life more enduring than any others of mortal race have possessed. A land was made for the Edain to dwell in, neither part of Middle-earth nor of Valinor, for it was sundered from either by a wide sea, yet it was nearer to Valinor. It was raised by Osse out of the depths of the great water, and it was established by Aule, and enriched by Yavanna, and the Eldar brought thither flowers and fountains out of Tol Eressëa. That land the Valar called Andor, the land of gift, and the star of Erendil shone bright in the west, as a token that all was made ready, and as a guide over the sea. And men marveled to see that silver flame in the paths of the sun. Then the Edain set sail upon the deep waters, following the star, and the Valar laid a peace upon the sea for many days, and sent sunlight and a sailing wind, so that the waters glittered before the eyes of the Edain like rippling glass, and the foam flew like snow before the stems of their ships. But so bright was Rothinzil that even at morning men could see it glimmering in the west, and in the cloudless night it shone alone, for no other star could stand beside it. And setting their course towards it, the Edain came at last over leagues of sea, and saw afar the land that was prepared for them, Andor, the land of gift, shimmering in a golden haze. Then they went up out of the sea and found a country fair and fruitful, and they were glad. And they called that land Elena, which is starwards, but also Anadune, which is westerness, Numenore in the high Eldarin tongue. This was the beginning of that people that in the grey elven speech are called the Dunedain, the Numenorians, kings among men. But they did not thus escape from the doom of death that Iluvatar had set upon all mankind, and they were mortal still, though their years were long, and they knew no sickness ere the shadow fell upon them. Therefore they grew wise and glorious, and in all things more like to the firstborn than any other of the kindreds of men, and they were tall, taller than the tallest of the sons of Middle-earth, and the light of their eyes was like the bright stars. But their numbers increased only slowly in the land, for though daughters and sons were born to them, fairer than their fathers, yet their children were few. Of old the chief city and haven of Numenor was in the midst of its western coasts, and it was called Andune, because it faced the sunset. But in the midst of the land was a mountain tall and steep, and it was named the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven. And upon it was a high place that was hallowed to Eru Iluvatar, and it was open and unroofed, and no other temple or fane was there in the land of the Numenorians. At the feet of the mountain were built the tombs of the kings, and hard by upon a hill was Armenelos, fairest of cities. And there stood the tower and the citadel that was raised by Elros, son of Erendil, whom the Valar appointed to be the first king of the Dunedain. Now Elros and Elrond his brother were descended from the three houses of the Edain, but in part also from the Eldar and the Maiar, for Idril of Gondolin and Luthien, daughter of Melian, were their foremothers. The Valar indeed may not withdraw the gift of death, which comes to men from Iluvatar, but in the matter of the half-elven, Iluvatar gave to them the judgment. And they judged that to the sons of Erendil should be given choice of their own destiny. And Elrond chose to remain with the firstborn, and to him the life of the firstborn was granted. But to Elros, who chose to be a king of men, still a great span of years was allotted, many times that of the men of Middle-earth. And all his line, the kings and lords of the royal house, had long life, even according to the measure of the Numenorians. But Elros lived 500 years, and ruled the Numenorians 400 years and 10. Thus the years passed, and while Middle-earth went backward and light and wisdom faded, the Dunedain dwelt under the protection of the Valar, and in the friendship of the Eldar, and they increased in stature both of mind and body. For though this people used still their own speech, their kings and lords knew and spoke also the Elven tongue, which they had learned in the days of their alliance, and thus they held converse still with the Eldar, whether of Erisea or of the westlands of Middle-earth. And the lore-masters among them learned also the high Eldarin tongue of the blessed realm, in which much story and song was preserved from the beginning of the world. And they made letters and scrolls and books, and wrote in them many things of wisdom and wonder in the high tide of their realm, of which all is now forgot. So it came to pass that, besides their own names, all the lords of the Númenóreans had also Eldarian names, and the like with the cities and fair places that they founded in Númenor, and on the shores of the hitherlands. For the Dunedain became mighty in crafts, so that if they had had the mind, they could easily have surpassed the evil kings of Middle-earth in the making of war and the forging of weapons, but they were become men of peace. Above all arts they nourished shipbuilding and seacraft, and they became mariners, whose like shall never be again seen, since the world was diminished, and voyaging upon the wide seas was the chief feat and adventure of their hardy men in the gallant days of their youth. But the lords of Valinor forbade them to sail so far westward that the coasts of Númenor could no longer be seen, and for long the Dunedain were content, though they did not fully understand the purpose of this ban. But the design of Manwë was that the Númenóreans should not be tempted to seek for the blessed realm, nor desire to overpass the limits set to their bliss, becoming enamored of the immortality of the Valar and the Eldar, and the lands where all things endure. For in those days Valinor still remained in the world visible, and there Iluvatar permitted the Valar to maintain upon earth an abiding place, a memorial of that which might have been, if Morgoth had not cast his shadow on the world. This the Númenóreans knew full well, and at times, when all the air was clear and the sun was in the east, they would look out and descry far off in the west a city white shining on a distant shore, and a great harbour and a tower. For in those days the Númenóreans were far-sighted, yet even so it was only the keenest eyes among them that could see this vision from the Meneltarma, maybe, or from some tall ship that lay off their western coast as far as it was lawful for them to go, for they did not dare to break the ban of the lords of the west. But the wise among them knew that this distant land was not indeed the blessed realm of Valinor, but was Avalon, the haven of the Eldar upon Eressëa, easternmost of the undying lands. And thence at times the firstborn still would come sailing to Númenor in oarless boats, as white birds flying from the sunset, and they brought to Númenor many gifts, birds of song and fragrant flowers, and herbs of great virtue. And a seedling they brought of Celeborn, the white tree that grew in the midst of Eressëa, and that was in its turn a seedling of Galathylion, the tree of Tuna, the image of Telperion, that Yavanna gave to the Eldar in the blessed realm. And the tree grew and blossomed in the courts of the king in Armenelos. Nimloth it was named, and flowered in the evening. In the shadows of night it filled with its fragrance. Thus it was that because of the ban of the Valar, the voyages of the Dunedain in those days went ever eastward and not westward, from the darkness of the north to the heats of the south, and beyond the south to the nether darkness, and they came even into the inner seas, and sailed about Middle-earth, and glimpsed from their high prows the gates of morning in the east. And the Dunedain came at times to the shores of the great lands, and they took pity on the forsaken world of Middle-earth. And the lords of Númenor set foot again upon the western shores in the dark years of men, and none yet dared to withstand them, for most of the men of that age that sat under the shadow were now grown weak and fearful. And coming among them, the Númenóreans taught them many things. Corn and wine they brought, and they instructed men in the sowing of seed, and the grinding of grain, in the hewing of wood, and the shaping of stone, and in the ordering of their life, such as it might be in the lands of swift death and little bliss. Then the men of Middle-earth were comforted, and here and there upon the western shores the houseless woods drew back, and men shook off the yoke of the offspring of Morgoth, and unlearned their terror of the dark, and they revered the memory of the tall sea kings. And when they had departed, they called them gods, hoping for their return. For at that time the Númenóreans dwelt never long in Middle-earth, nor made there as yet any habitation of their own. Eastward they must sail, but ever west their hearts returned. Now this yearning grew ever greater with the years, and the Númenóreans began to hunger for the undying city that they saw from afar, and the desire of everlasting life, to escape from death and the ending of delight, grew strong upon them. And ever as their power and glory grew greater, their unquiet increased. For though the Valar had rewarded the Dunedain with long life, they could not take from them the weariness of the world that comes at last, and they died, even their kings of the seed of Erendil. And the span of their lives was brief in the eyes of the Eldar. Thus it was that a shadow fell upon them, in which maybe the will of Morgoth was at work that still moved in the world. And the Númenóreans began to murmur, at first in their hearts, and then in open words, against the doom of men, and most of all against the ban which forbade them to sail into the west. And they said among themselves, Why do the lords of the west sit there in peace unending, while we must die and go we know not whither, leaving our home and all that we have made? And the Eldar die not, even those that rebelled against the lords. And since we have mastered all seas, and no water is so wild or so wide that our ships cannot overcome it, why should we not go to Avalon, and greet there our friends? And some there were who said, Why should we not go even to Aman, and taste there, were it but for a day, the bliss of the powers? Have we not become mighty among the people of Arda? The Eldar reported these words to the Valar, and Manwë was grieved, seeing a cloud gather on the noontide of Númenor. And he sent messengers to the Dunedain, who spoke earnestly to the king, and all who would listen, concerning the fate and fashion of the world. The doom of the world, they said, one alone can change who made it. And were you so to voyage, that escaping all deceits and snares you came indeed to Aman, the blessed realm, little would it profit you, for it is not the land of Manwë that makes its people deathless, but the deathless that dwell therein have hallowed the land, and there you would but wither and grow weary the sooner, as moths in a light too strong and steadfast. But the king said, And does not Erendil my forefather live, or is he not in the land of Aman? To which they answered, You know that he has a fate apart, and was adjudged to the firstborn who die not, yet this also is his doom, that he can never return again to mortal lands, whereas you and your people are not of the firstborn, but are mortal men, as Iluvatar made you. Yet it seems that you desire now to have the good of both kindreds, to sail to Valinor when you will, and to return when you please to your homes. That cannot be, nor can the Valar take away the gifts of Iluvatar. The Eldar, you say, are unpunished, and even those who rebel do not die. Yet that is to them neither reward nor punishment, but the fulfillment of their being. They cannot escape, and are bound to this world, never to leave it so long as it lasts, for its life is theirs. And you are punished for the rebellion of men, you say, in which you had small part, and so it is that you die. But that was not at first appointed for a punishment. These you escape, and leave the world, and are not bound to it, in hope or in weariness. Which of us therefore should envy the others? And the Númenóreans answered, Why should we not envy thee, Valar, or even the least of the deathless? For of us is required a blind trust, and a hope without assurance, knowing not what lies before us in a little while, and yet we also love the earth, and would not lose it. Then the messenger said, Indeed, the mind of Iluvatar concerning you is not known to the Valar, and he has not revealed all things that are to come. But this we hold to be true, that your home is not here, neither in the land of Aman, nor anywhere within the circles of the world, and the doom of men, that they should depart, was at first a gift of Iluvatar. It became a grief to them only because, coming under the shadow of Morgoth, It seemed to them that they were surrounded by a great darkness, of which they were afraid, and some grew wilful and proud, and would not yield until life was wrest from them. We who bear the ever-mounting burden of the years do not clearly understand this, but if that grief has returned to trouble you, as you say, then we fear that the shadow arises once more, and grows again in your hearts. Therefore, though you be the Dunedain, fairest of men, who escaped from the shadow of old and fought valiantly against it, we say to you, beware. The will of Eru may not be gainsaid, and the Valar bid you earnestly not to withhold the trust to which you are called, lest soon it become again a bond by which you are constrained. Hope rather that in the end even the least of your desires shall have fruit. The love of Arda was set in your hearts by Iluvatar, and he does not plant to no purpose. There nonetheless, many ages of men unborn may pass, ere that purpose is made known, and to you it will be revealed, and not to the Valar. These things took place in the days of Tar-Kiriatan, the shipbuilder, and of Tar-Atanamer, his son. And they were proud men, eager for wealth, and they laid the men of Middle-earth under tribute, taking now rather than giving. It was to Tar-Atanamir that the messengers came, and he was the 13th king. And in his day the realm of Númenor had endured for more than 2,000 years, and was come to the zenith of its bliss, if not yet of its power. But Atanamir was ill pleased at the counsel of the messengers, and gave little heed to it, and the greater part of his people followed him, for they wished still to escape death in their own day, not waiting upon hope. And Atanamir lived to a great age, clinging to his life beyond the end of all joy, and he was the first of the Númenorians to do this, refusing to depart until he was witless and unmanned, and denying to his son the kingship at the height of his days. For the lords of Númenor had been wont to wed late in their long lives, and to depart, and leave the mastery of their sons to their sons, when these were come to full stature of body and mind. Then Tar-Ankaliman, son of Atanamir, became king, and he was of like mind. And in his day the people of Númenor became divided. On the one hand was the greater party, and they were called the king's men, and they grew proud, and were estranged from the Eldar and the Valar. And on the other hand was the lesser party, and they were called the Elendili, the Elf-friends. For though they remained loyal indeed to the king and to the house of Elros, they wished to keep the friendship of the Eldar, and they hearkened to the counsel of the lords of the West. Nonetheless, even they, who named themselves the Faithful, did not wholly escape from the affliction of their people, and they were troubled by the thought of death. Thus the bliss of Westerness became diminished, but still its might and splendor increased, for the kings and their people had not yet abandoned wisdom, and if they loved the Valar no longer, at least they still feared them. They did not dare openly to break the ban, or to sail beyond the limits that had been appointed. Eastward still they steered their tall ships, but the fear of death grew ever darker upon them, and they delayed it by all means that they could. And they began to build great houses for their dead, while their wise men labored unceasingly to discover, if they might, the secret of recalling life, or at the least of the prolonging of men's days. Yet they achieved only the art of preserving incorrupt the dead flesh of men, and they filled all the land with silent tombs, in which the thought of death was enshrined in the darkness. But those that lived turned the more eagerly to pleasure and revelry, desiring ever more goods and more riches. And after the days of Tar-Ankaliman, the offering of the first fruits of Eru was neglected, and men went seldom any more to the hollow upon the heights of Meneltarma in the midst of the land. Thus it came to pass that in that time that the Númenóreans first made great settlements upon the west shores of the ancient lands. For their own land seemed to them shrunken, and they had no rest or content therein, and they desired now wealth and dominion in Middle-earth, since the west was denied. Great harbours and strong towers they made, and there many of them took up their abode. But they appeared now rather as lords and masters, and gatherers of tribute, than as helpers and teachers. And the great ships of the Númenóreans were borne east on the winds, and returned ever laden, and the power and majesty of their kings were increased. And they drank, and they feasted, and they clad themselves in silver and gold. In all this the elf friends had small part. They alone came now ever to the north and the land of Gilgalad, keeping the friendship with the elves, and lending them aid against Sauron. And their haven was Pelargir, above the mouths of Anduin the Great. But the king's men sailed far away to the south, and their lordships and strongholds that they made have left many rumors in the legends of men. The Akalabeth is to be continued. Please purchase your own copy of the Silmarillion. This is just a reading.